Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for moderating our panel here this morning. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate the fact that you're so engaged in the political process. One of the things I worry about this election year in particular, because Americans are so dissatisfied with what's played out politically in the last year or two, is that people stop engaging in what's so important in our democracy, which is participating politically, engaging whether it be locally or at the national level, getting behind causes you care about, because our entire democracy, our entire way of life is really dependent upon people participating. So the fact we have such a nice full room here is encouraging, and I thank you for doing that. I'll be brief because we want to get into the questions that Jonathan has here, but I have been many of yours representative in Congress since 2012 when I was first elected. I spent my entire career really outside of government, not involved in politics or government at all. I was in the private sector. As Jonathan said, I started two businesses here in Maryland. They were both based in Chevy Chase. My first company was called Healthcare Financial Partners, which is a company that specialized in lending money to small to mid-sized healthcare companies. And then my second company was called Capital Source, which specialized in lending money to small to mid-sized businesses all over the United States. I was very proud of my performance at those businesses. We started these two companies from scratch. We created several thousand jobs here in Maryland. They both became public companies. I was given awards. I was the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award. President Obama gave my second business an award for servicing underbanked communities with high-quality, ethical lending services. So I really spent my whole career as an entrepreneur. I'm not from this area. I'm originally from North Jersey, where I grew up right outside of New York City. My father was a union electrician for 60 years. That union sent me to college on a scholarship at Columbia University. I moved down here to Washington to go to law school at Georgetown, which is where I met my wife, best day that ever happened to me. And we stayed here and started our family and raised our children here. We have 4 daughters. My oldest is 23, just out of college, and my youngest is 9. She's just started 4th grade. We decided to run for office as really an extension of kind of the philanthropic and community service work we had been doing for several years. We were getting tremendous rewards out of that part of our lives, and we wanted to really focus the rest of our lives after my business career on public service. My wife co-founded a nonprofit called Common Sense Media, which works on media literacy for children, and she's involved in a whole variety of philanthropic activities, including most recently she's the chair of the board at Georgetown Law School. So that's a little about me. As your member of Congress, I've been focusing on a variety of issues. Obviously, most importantly, things that are important in my district, things like veterans issues. I have the privilege of representing so many service men and women who have served our country, and I've worked very hard to advance their rights and issues that are important to them. I've used my background as a business builder, as an entrepreneur, to work on economic policy that's really important, not only for the district, but our country, things like transportation, tax reform, making sure that the entrepreneurial economy can be successful. The fact that I spent my whole career in the private sector and not in government has allowed me to be very bipartisan. I think that's our principal responsibility as an elected official, to take the trust that you give us and to go to Congress and work with people on your side of the aisle and on the other side of the aisle to create solutions, advance new ideas. I was ranked the 3rd most bipartisan member of the House of Representatives last year in terms of new legislation I introduced on a bipartisan basis, and top 10% in the whole of the Congress for joining with my colleagues on bipartisan initiatives. And I spent a lot of time servicing the district. The district starts basically at the 270 Beltway intersection and goes all the way to Western Maryland, Deep Creek Lake. So it's about half of Montgomery County, if you will, Frederick City, not Frederick County, and all of Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett counties. We spend a lot of time in the district. In the last year alone, I've had about 25 individual office hours around the district, which in addition to the 2 offices we have where I go into libraries, community centers, whatever the case may be, set up shop, we advertise, and we see all comers. Sometimes 70, 80 people come, we stay for hours, hearing what people have to say. Sometimes they want to talk about national politics, sometimes they have a very specific issue. I've had about 25 large-scale workshops Some of these have upwards of 500 people attend them, where we bring in experts from the federal government, from the private sector, to talk about veterans issues, seniors issues, identity theft, job fairs, a whole variety of issues. So that's how I think about the job, and it's a real privilege to have this opportunity to represent you, and I look forward to your questions. So again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Congressman Delaney. Obviously, this being a Jewish forum, the first question, and you've been asked about a couple of cards on this. You voted for the Iran deal. Why did you support it, and do you have any regrets now as there have been reports of violations by Iran and the EU tests that they had on their bombers?
So I did support the deal, and at this point, as I see the deal unfolding, I don't regret that decision, because I think the principal thrust of the agreement was to reduce Iran's nuclear capabilities, and it has done that. 98% of the low-level enriched uranium has been removed from the country. 2/3 of the centrifuges are no longer operational. Cement's been poured in the main reactor that we were concerned about. And as a result of those actions, Iran's breakout capabilities, which at the time of the deal was a couple weeks, most experts now believe, by almost any measure, it's in excess of a year. So I think as it relates to the core, kind of, if you will, four corners of the agreement, which was to be a nuclear agreement, I think it's accomplished that objective. Was the agreement the kind of agreement I would have liked to have negotiated? No. Did it have very significant deficiencies related to it? The answer to that is yes. It should have had a much longer duration. A 15-year duration was too short. It should have been at least 25 years, in my opinion. It should have dealt with their use of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Ideally, it would have dealt with their other activities in the region, their funding of terror, and their human rights violations. But pretty early into the negotiation of the deal, it became clear that some of those bigger issues were off the table by both sides, right? Which also means, by the way, as it relates to their funding of terror, as it relates to their terrorist activities, as it relates to their human rights violations, as it relates to their use of intercontinental ballistic missiles, we should, and I believe we will, continue to sanction Iran for those activities. Since they didn't want to make those activities part of the deal, we shouldn't act like they're part of the deal, right? And the distrust we have for that country that we had before the deal, I think all of us still have here today, and we should be cracking down hard as it relates to those violations. But as it relates to what the agreement at the end of the day actually covered, which was the nuclear capability of Iran, I believe the agreement accomplished that objective. I believe that agreement accomplished that objective. And I think as it relates to where we stand here today, Iran is much further from having a nuclear capability, and that's why I voted for the agreement. I also think in the context of all of our partners agreeing to this agreement, right, it was the right thing to do.
We've got a couple of questions about Israel. This question wants to know, what bills, resolutions have you originated, or what have you signed on to, one of the early sponsors of pro-Israel bills, and what will you do in terms of strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Well, Israel is obviously our most important ally, not only in that region, but probably our most important ally as it relates to many things in the world. I think putting aside the Iran deal, because that obviously took a lot of attention, and I think strained the relationship, and unfortunately made an issue that has been very bipartisan, meaning the support of Israel. It made it a partisan issue for a moment in time. My sense is the efforts to ensure that there's strong bipartisan support of Israel, but at all various sides in this debate have come back together around that issue. I think the issues that are important to Israel going forward, and then I'll get to specific legislation, is obviously the memorandum of understanding that was recently announced. I think it's a very important and good first step. Again, I don't think that's perfect. I was disappointed that our funding, which right now, part of our funding, about 25% of our funding, can go directly to the defense industry in Israel, that's going to have to be reduced over time. I think that's short-sighted because I think it's not only in the interest of Israel, but I think it's in the interest of the United States to have a robust, successful defense industry in Israel. So I didn't love that aspect of the deal. But in general, it's the largest aid package the United States has ever provided. I think the funding levels were certainly acceptable to Israel. I think they're acceptable to the people here who are advocating for funding of critical needs within Israel. So I think that memorandum of understanding was a very good and important step in the relationship right now. I think we have to be very important, and I've signed on to various bills that are affirmatively expressing the fact that we don't agree with the boycott and divestment and sanction movement that's going on around the world. I think that's very troubling. I think it's unfair, and I think it lays the groundwork for anti-Semitism. So that's one area of legislation where I've signed on significantly, which is to ensure that that doesn't continue, or the Congress taking affirmative steps or making affirmative statements, that at no level do we agree with what the intent of that movement is trying to get at. The other thing in terms of legislation I've signed on to, and letters, is as it relates to the peace process between Israel and Palestine, ensuring that this peace process, which everyone wants to occur, is done between the two parties and not imposed by third parties. So there's been a variety of legislation and letters that have made that clear. It's the intent of the Congress of the United States to only support a peace process where the two parties are directly negotiating at the table amongst and between themselves and coming to an agreement. Because that's the only way I think you can ultimately have peace in the region. If third-party nations or groups of nations get together and try to impose their will upon the two parties who need to be negotiating directly, that ultimately will not be successful, and nor do I think it's fair for Israel. So there's been a variety of legislation and bills and letters related to that. And then most recently, I was the lead member of the House introducing legislation that renews and expands the Iran Sanction Act. If you look at what Iran's done recently with their intercontinental ballistic missiles and other advancements they've made as it relates to conventional weapons, the Iran Sanction Act is outdated and doesn't cover those activities. So I've introduced and led legislation to strengthen that important piece of legislation and make sure it gets renewed, because one of the premises of the Iran nuclear deal is that if Iran violates the agreement, we can snap sanctions back in place. A lot of you have heard the term snapback sanctions. But we can't actually snap those sanctions back in place unless we have the sanctions. Right? The premise of the nuclear agreement is that the sanctions exist, but you press pause on them, provided Iran is living with the terms of the agreement. And if they stop living with the terms of the agreement, or living within the terms of the agreement, you release the pause button and the sanctions snap back in place. Those sanctions are set to expire. So I've been a leader in the Congress in renewing those sanctions, but also broadening them and strengthening them so that they cover activities that Iran is clearly engaged in that are in violation of UN resolutions. Most obviously, their testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So what my legislation does is expand what's covered by the Iran Sanctions Act as part of its renewal.
We got a couple of questions about a comment you made recently at a forum in Kentlands where you equated Syrian refugees with Jewish refugees. Are they similar? And if so, why or why not?
I didn't equate them. So that...
Yes, you did.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
Go ahead.
I talked about what's going on with Syrian refugee crisis, which I think is the leading humanitarian crisis in the world right now. Where over 10 million citizens of Syria have been displaced from their home, which is the equivalent of 160 million Americans being displaced from their home, right? And millions of Syrians are migrating, mostly across Europe, and is causing fairly significant issues across that continent. And I said, and I was answering the question in the context of the fact that I broke with my party and was one of the few Democrats to support strengthening the process for admitting Syrian refugees into the United States. In other words, there was a bill in the House that said, as part of our allowing Syrian refugees to migrate to the United States, and again, our number for the number of refugees we've targeted is a very small number relative to the number of refugees. there was a bill in the House that basically said the administration had to certify that in processing all those refugees coming to this country, that they had to certify that all the processes and procedures were followed, right, to ensure that our homeland security, if you will, was preserved. Right, so that bill came to the floor of the House. I voted for that bill. I was one of the few Democrats to vote for that bill. I broke with my party on that. That was what the question was about at the forum. And then I spoke about refugees generally, and across time, that this has been a crisis that the world has faced throughout history. And that's when I made a reference to the fact that I think the Jewish people could appreciate that, because there were times when countries weren't as open to Jewish refugees as they should have been. And that was the point I made. So I think to characterize that as me equating the situation, I don't think is an accurate description.
The bill itself would require the FBI director to certify that there would be no danger of terrorism with any of the refugees in the country, and your party voted against it because the FBI director has said he can't be 100% certain, but the Obama administration said you can be almost certain, nothing can be 100%, where they're saying that you've got a sense where of all of the refugees admitted to the country since 9/11, less than a fraction of 1% were actually involved in any sort of terrorist activity or any possible links to terrorism. Are those certifications enough that the track record is that good, or do you think there has to be an absolute 100% ironclad guarantee before any Syrians are admitted to the U.S.?
But it's very hard to have a 100% absolute ironclad guarantee on anything. Who does it come from? So let me give you my view of these certifications. So I contrasted it to a role I had in the private sector when I was the CEO of a publicly traded company, when a law was passed called Sarbanes-Oxley, right, which was a broad sweeping piece of legislation dealing with publicly traded companies, and it came out of the Enron fraud. And what Sarbanes-Oxley requires the CEO of a publicly traded company to do is to certify that their financial statements are accurate. Not to the best of your knowledge, not pretty close to accurate, but you had to certify that they were accurate. No one wants to sign a certification. If you give anyone the opportunity to avoid signing a certification where they certify that something is 100% accurate, any sane human being will take the option of not signing a certification and putting themselves on the line. When Sarbanes-Oxley was coming down the pike, all the public company CEOs were complaining that we'll quit, we won't run a public company, we won't certify this, the law was passed. And what did we all do? We all certified our financial statements. Now what did we do? We put in place procedures to make sure that what we thought was being done more carefully. Right? I created in my companies a series of certifications from my executives who reported to me, where they would certify that the numbers in their division were accurate, and then I would accumulate all these certifications, and I would know the process was followed, and then I signed my certification. So I drew an analogy to this process as it relates to refugees, which is obviously a much more serious and is a process with greater gravitas associated to it. But in some ways it was similar. Of course the administration doesn't want to sign a certification. Of course the president doesn't want to sign a certification if he doesn't have to. But why wouldn't we want them to do that? Because we know if they do that, they'll make the processes they have to follow and the procedures they have to follow more robust, and they'll be more careful about them. And that's why I voted for that legislation. Did I believe that those certifications would be an absolute guarantee that no Syrian refugee, or anyone in our immigration process for that matter, who comes into this country, right, wouldn't have something in their background that would cause problems, right? I think that's an awfully high standard. I don't know who could provide a guarantee that we ultimately are comfortable with. But did I believe people had to sign on the line and show that they were responsible and show that they were following the procedures? Absolutely.
I mentioned in my introduction, President Obama on Friday vetoed a bill that you supported to allow 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia or anybody else who funded terrorist attacks. Are you going to vote to override that veto?
Yes, I will. I supported the bill when it came around the first time.
This person writes, as a young voter and clearly I am not at this point. Climate change is an important issue, especially since this person's generation will have to deal with the consequences of a rapidly warming world. Do you believe in climate change, and what policies would you support to combat it?
I do believe in climate change. I think the data is very clear. I think if you go to 100 serious scientists on this issue, 98, 99 of them will tell you it's an issue, right? And if we don't address it, it could have very significant implications, both economically here and from a geopolitical standpoint. Estimates have been done that the millennials are inheriting about $181,000 of liability related to climate change that we're not dealing with. The military has been one of the most forward-leaning and progressive groups on this issue. And that's pretty obvious if you think about what the military does, right? They're spending a lot of time in places around the world that could be massively destabilized by rising sea water. In Bangladesh, for example, they estimate, this is one country, Bangladesh, alone by 2040, 20 million people will be displaced from their homes. As I said a few minutes ago, in Syria, 10 million people have been displaced from their homes. And think about the chaos that has caused around the world, not only in the Middle East and within Europe, because 10 million people have been displaced from their homes. What's going to happen when 20 million people are displaced from their homes in Bangladesh, or go to other places in Southeast Asia? There's a strong correlation between poverty and whether you live at or below sea level. Unfortunately, a lot of people in poverty around the world live at or below sea level. So the U.S. military, whose job it is to patrol these parts of the world, and when there's unrest, respond in some way, sees that this is a very significant issue. This is an economic issue and it's a geopolitical issue. And as I said, 98, 99 out of 100 scientists will say it's an issue. I know with one of my 4 daughters, if I took one of them to 100 pediatricians, and 98 or 99 of them said she had an issue and I had to deal with it, I would deal with it. I wouldn't wait to convince the 1 or 2 that didn't agree with me. So I think this is a very significant issue. And as I said, I think it has economic issues for the United States of America. Because if the data, which I think is fairly clear, right, continues, we will have to deal with this as a nation. And it'll cost a tremendous amount of money, which will have to come from the government and the taxpayers to deal with it. Right, so I think we're leaving a future generation a very significant debt as it relates to this issue. And I think, again, the geopolitical implications, I think, are very significant. The good news, in my opinion, is you can deal with this in a way that is consistent with a pro-growth economy. In other words, I think there's a very significant opportunity for the United States of America to be a leader in the advanced energy economy, which I believe will exist around the world. A lot of young people come to me all the time, because I was in business, I started these companies, and they say, what field should I go into? And I always tell them, I'd go in the energy business. And the reason I'd go in the energy business is not because of what's going on today, not because of the price of oil or the volatility in the energy markets, but because it seems to me in 50 years, the way we produce, conserve, distribute, and use energy will be fundamentally different than the way it is today. Because I think ultimately we and the world will respond to this crisis. The governor of the Bank of England, which is the equivalent of our Federal Reserve chair, gave a speech about 6 months ago saying that he thought the main risk to the global financial system was not bank regulations or insufficient capital in banks, but it is in fact climate change. Because what will happen when people finally have a view that this data is likely to continue and what the ultimate implications of it will be, they will reprice assets around the world. They'll reprice insurance contracts that have exposure to this. They'll reprice real estate assets that are affected by this. They'll reprice energy assets, and that could destabilize the whole financial system. So this, I think, is a very significant issue. And I think the way you deal with it, I have proposed a bill that basically prices carbon, which is a market-based solution. The revenues generated from that bill, which are substantial, we use to provide tax breaks to individuals and to small businesses. The title of our bill is Tax Pollution, Not Profits. Because I would much rather tax something that I think we want less of, which is carbon-producing energy, and provide tax relief, right, to something we want more of, which is household incomes and profits. And I think a proposal like that could be put forth in conjunction with regulatory relief. Because what's happened basically since we haven't been able to do any of these things the federal government and a variety of states have put in place regulations. So they haven't gone towards a market-based solution to the issue, they've moved towards a regulatory solution. And whether people realize it or not, regulations are taxes. But unlike taxes, you don't generate any revenues, which hopefully you could do something positive with. So that's my view of the issue, and that's my view of what the solution should be.
We're running out of time, unfortunately. I have one last question before you give your closing statement, and got a couple of questions on this. You talked about your bipartisanship. Yet people want to know, why is there so much dysfunction in Washington, and how can you work in such a divided Congress?
So it is difficult to work in a divided Congress. You know, the root cause problem of the gridlock and dysfunction in the House of Representatives, at least, is the way that congressional districts are created in this country. Right, the gerrymandering process that goes on across the United States in both Democrat and Republican states is really threatening representative democracy as we know it, which is why I was the lead co-sponsor, and I created the legislation, to create national redistricting reform to require all the states to effectively have independent commissions to establish their congressional districts. We also require top two primary processes, which means that the people get the most top two votes in any primary go to the general election, which means you could have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans in a general election, and we make election day a holiday. The reason I think this is a problem is because right now about 80 or 85 of the congressional districts in the United States are considered safe. Meaning, if it's a safe Democrat seat, it's almost impossible for a Republican to win. Safe Republican seat is almost impossible for a Democrat to win. So if you believe incentives matter, which I do, my experience in the private sector, and maybe some of you, your own experience in the private sector, teaches you the power of incentives. Those individuals have an incentive to not talk to half the country. Because from a political perspective, the only threat they have is a primary. So they can only, if they're in a safe Republican district, they can only lose to a Republican in the primary and vice versa for a Democrat. And I think that's a very significant problem. And I've seen, because again, I'm ranked 3rd in terms of bipartisan members of the House of Representatives. What that means is I work on a lot of bipartisan bills. Because quite frankly, I think there's no point to work on partisan messaging bills, right? It may sound good, it may give you good sound bites, you may be able to go in front of your party base and yell and scream and pound the table, but it actually has nothing to do with governing. Governing involves getting people on the other side of the aisle to hopefully agree with your ideas, work together so you can get them passed. And so as someone who goes around, has meetings with Republicans and Democrats on bipartisan bills, what I hear a lot is I'll go into someone like, for example, I have this very large infrastructure repatriation bill, which basically reforms our international tax system, where U.S. corporations currently have $2 trillion trapped overseas. Right? They have more cash overseas than they do in the United States, which is a huge missed opportunity for our country. It reforms that system, creating an incentive for them to bring the money back, which will generate revenues for the U.S. government, by the way, because we're getting virtually no revenues on those revenues. And we take those revenues and we use it for a large-scale national infrastructure program. Because I think our top domestic economic priority should be infrastructure. We see it here in Maryland's 6th District, which is 270, which is a disaster. I'm now the chair of something called Fix 270 Now, which should be the top priority, in my opinion, for Montgomery County, and similar issues in the western part of my district. But improving our infrastructure not only improves the lives of our citizens, it creates jobs, and it makes our businesses more competitive. So I put together this big bipartisan bill to fix international tax and build infrastructure. I've got 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans on it in the House. I've got about 7 or 8 Democrats and 7 or 8 senators on it in the Senate. It's the most bipartisan piece of economic legislation in the Congress. But in going around with that bill, I would sit down with a lot of Republicans or Democrats in safe districts. I'll sit down with a Democrat in a very safe district, I'll say, what do you think of this? And he or she is like, well, that's a really good idea. But you have a lot of Republicans on there. I'm like, well, yeah, it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. And they're like, you know, if I'm on a bill like that, in my primary, they're going to say that I'm in bed with Republicans. Look at that one Republican you have on the bill. He's always screaming and yelling about one or other thing, and that'll be bad for me. Same conversation with Republicans in safe districts. And that's the problem with the Congress. The problem with the Congress is the elected officials are not behaving like normal Americans. They're not behaving like normal Americans. They're focused on their party base, They think half the country is wrong, right? And listen, the United States of America would not be the kind of country it is. We would not be the kind of exceptional nation we are if half the population were always wrong about everything they believe. But if you listen to the political parties, they'll tell you that. That's the biggest crisis we have. And my fear, tying back to my opening statement, is that this dysfunction is turning off the American people, and in turn, turning them off to the political process. And that'll only make the problem work. Because this problem is solved by more people participating, more people voting, more people paying attention, more people understanding the issues, and citizens voting for people who are actually committed to work on a bipartisan basis. Because all of the big issues we face, right, the fiscal trajectory of this country, which is unsustainable, which is why I introduced bipartisan legislation, once again, to reform the Social Security program, which is a remarkably successful program and is relatively easy to fix. But for political reasons, people have been unwilling to do that. I have the only bipartisan bill on Social Security reform in the Congress. Right? That's why I'm committed. Whether it's that issue, which by the way affects every priority we have, whether you care about domestic priorities or national security, if we don't fix the fiscal trajectory of this country, we won't be able to afford any of those priorities. So whether you care about that, whether you care about our national security, whether you care about domestic priorities, whether you care about criminal justice reform, investing in infrastructure, reforming the education system, whatever it is, the path to solving these problems is only down the bipartisan road. It's only down the bipartisan road. We see when people have jammed through partisan legislation, in those brief moment in times where one party or the other controls the government, that legislation rarely lives a healthy life. And the Affordable Care Act is a good example. Where if these things were done on a bipartisan basis, where you actually listen to what the other side had to say, and you acknowledge, as I do, that there are really good ideas in the progressive and liberal movement in the United States of America, and there are really good ideas in the conservative movement in the United States of America. And we as policymakers should be finding the best ideas wherever they reside and putting them together for the common good of the citizens. That's our job in Washington, and that's what's wrong in Washington. So how do I work in that system? Well, the only way I know how. The only way I know how, right? When I didn't have enough money to go to college and had to get scholarships, when I started a business with nothing, you put your head down, you grind it out, you do the work, you come up with new ideas, and you sit down with people in a respectful manner, and you try to convince them of the power of your ideas, you listen to what they have to say, and you try to forge common ground. And you treat them in a civil manner. You treat them in a civil manner. You acknowledge that some of the things they have to say actually do make sense and are good ideas. And I'm one of the few doing that right now, but I never bet against the American people, right? If you look back, everyone always says the country's worse than it used to be. That's a bunch of garbage. By any measure, the country continues to get better, just like the world continues to get better. And I'd argue that point any day to anyone. I'm a huge optimist. I'm very optimistic about the United States. I'm very optimistic about Maryland, about my district.